Okay, so this is the key. These questions that we ask are the starting point, and we're going to look at questions when we talk about brainstorming first thing tomorrow morning. But now we've talked about the smaller good questions, because this is the most great question. Now we've kind of hit that point where we've recognized we've asked the questions we need to ask, and we can see the big picture and what's the big question. In other words, how are we defining the situation? Abdu'l-Baha tells us, and we're on number 4 now, Envision. Every imperfect soul is self-centered and thinketh only of his own good. But as his thoughts expand a little, he will begin to think of the welfare and comfort of his family. If his ideas still more widen, his concern will be the felicity of his fellow citizens. And if they still widen, he will be thinking of the glory of his land and race. But when his ideas and views reach the utmost degree of expansion and attain the stage of perfection, then he will be interested in the exaltation of humankind. He will then be the well-wisher of all men and the seeker of the weal and prosperity of all lands. This is indicative of perfection. And I offer this because this is a great way to think in terms of what we call framing, looking at the big picture. Now, in every problem that you face, you don't say, well, what about the exaltation of humankind? Because that's too big every time. The point here, though, is to think bigger than where you're at now. And when I talked about raising the issue to the level of unity, remember the question earlier said, how can we all work together to help a dog live according to what we feel is acceptable? That is a question that everyone agrees with, right? I mean, who couldn't agree with that? What are you going to say? You say, well, no, I don't think we should do that. No, I mean, it's raising that question to the higher level. So we're going to, and this quote from Bertrand Russell says, the greatest challenge to any thinker is stating the problem in a way that will allow a solution. So don't let your definition of your discussion, of what you're trying to decide, put you in a box, keep you from deciding whatever that might be. So Paul Lample talks about, there we go, talks not specifically about framing, but that's really what he's talking about when you listen to this. This is from the tapes that have been on the U.S. website for a little over a year. Listen for the fact he talks about transcending the dichotomy. It's exactly what we're talking about, getting outside of the yes and no's, to weaving elements together. Remember we talked about with Bloom's taxonomy, the highest stage of Bloom's taxonomy is a synthesis of weaving elements into a pattern of growth. And it's greater than the sum of its parts. Okay? So listen for these elements as we listen to Paul Lample talk really essentially about framing the community, how we frame Baha'i community.
One of our tendencies is to collapse everything into a dichotomy and see one thing or the other. So, for example, we have devotional meetings, and we want to have those devotional meetings in neighborhoods. Suddenly it becomes no devotional meetings in local centers anymore. And so then it becomes a debate. Do we have meetings in local centers? Do we not have meetings in local centers? When then we lose track of the whole idea that really what we're trying to do is create devotional life for every single person in the cluster. So we pretty much need every place we can have a devotional meeting, but then we have smaller spaces and bigger spaces, and we learn how to create that pattern. So when we're learning to do something new, one tendency is to try to collapse it in a formula or a recipe. So everybody has to do this exactly like this in this order in order for it to be effective. And then some of the friends say, well, no, I don't want to do it that way. I think we should do anything we want. And so then the debate becomes, is there one thing or is everything good? And the answer is that the resolution of most of these dichotomies is not answered in the either or. You have to kind of transcend the dichotomy, and then you start to see a bigger pattern where these various elements can be understood. So it's true that our action in the cluster should not collapse into some formula or recipe about how growth can take place. That won't work. That's not what the House of Justice asked for. But then that doesn't mean that the opposite is true, where everybody can do whatever they want. What we're trying to do is learn how to work together. Learn how, in a spirit of learning, through study, consultation, action, and reflection, where different people do different things. We appreciate the unity and diversity of the different actions we're called to, and we learn how to weave those different elements together in a pattern of vibrant growth. So it's like the idea of the individual human being. We look at the human body. It's made up of many different cells. Not all those cells are doing the same thing. They do different things. Some do certain organs, but then you also have to figure out how to organize those organs into certain systems. So gradually, the human body is composed of a unity and diversity of cells operating in different ways, which brings forth something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And the Baha'i community is attempting to do the same thing. Sometimes there's a need to focus on a particular thing. Like in the human body, when you have one cell, the idea is to focus on having more cells. You can't go off to university and get a college degree as one cell. You need more cells. Then those cells have to organize themselves. Then they have to differentiate. Finally, a baby is born. But that baby still can't go off to college and get a degree. It's got to learn how to crawl. It's got to learn how to talk. So many different stages of development. Each stage has different requirements until the day does come when the child does go off to college and does get the degree. But only because the previous stages came before and were systematic. So this is the pattern that we're learning how to create. Again, described in the Rizvan message, described by the Teaching Center in its document. It's a cluster that's vibrant in its activity. Everybody is involved. Everybody is participating. As many people as possible are initiating activities. The types of activity they're initiating are very diverse. They're the core activities, of course, but then, again, they're called core activities, not only activities. So around them also come other activities as well, but not just activities for the sake of doing something different because I don't like core activities. Activities that are integrated and complement and reinforce the pattern that's being developed by the core activities themselves. All kinds of teaching activities, administrative work, social life, social and economic development begins to emerge after a certain point. But all these things have to be woven together in a tapestry. It's not an either-or of some uniform thing or anything goes. It's something that transcends that, and that's what the House of Justice is describing.
So that's the stage that we're at right now in the program, is talking about transcending dichotomies, weaving elements into larger patterns, and looking at the bigger picture. Okay, I want to talk about that because before we were talking about children's classes, we knew it had problems maybe with teachers' behavior and attendance. Now we're saying, well, what's the bigger frame for that? The reason for asking questions is to give more choices, and the reason for asking bigger questions is to give bigger choices. Okay, we don't always want to do that. But in the most difficult issues, it's vital that we do that. Okay, there are difficult issues because we have limited choices. We want more choices, ask bigger questions. Okay. So, the pattern, as you can see in your handout, that we're talking about for these questions, these are very similar to what we just looked at in asking better questions. But the question obviously is honest, it's trustworthy, it's caring, it attracts unity, promotes equality, it's focused on the future, neutral, looks at the big picture, it's positive. But again, a frame raises the issue to the level of unity. The frame is the way of stating the problem that everyone agrees with. There's no question about that. Paul Lample, what frame did you hear him use when you listened to that? What was the frame that he used? Remember he talked about, well, we can have devotions in homes or we can have devotions in centers. But the bigger picture was what?
The cluster.
The cluster. What about the cluster?
Have all of it.
No, but what about the cluster? The spiritual development of the cluster. Okay? And when you raise it to that level, that raises it even above devotions. You know, you get very creative. I mean, we had in China, Cindy started what were called yoga devotionals. Yoga with devotionals. And we actually found a lot of receptive Chinese through yoga. I found receptive Chinese through playing ping pong. Seriously, you know, in different ways. But reframe what you're trying to do, to look at the bigger picture in some ways. Okay? And then that frame will generate more choices for you. That frame, because it's like playing on a bigger field. With a bigger field, you just have more choices. Now, we will talk about how to manage more choices. Because, you have 100 choices, now what do? We have too many. Well, I'll tell you, I'll give you many strategies for sorting through choices quickly and finding where the points of consensus are. Okay? Because I don't want you to feel overwhelmed because this might create too many choices. Because we have very simple ways of sorting through those and finding where we need to go. Okay? So I want to, I know, boy, it's a long day, isn't it? We want to take a look now at the big question. I want to offer you the choice in whatever you might want to address. What the common assignment everyone has is to generate a frame of whatever you select. So you could, and I'll give choices. We'll see what those choices might be. As a matter of fact, maybe we'll just do that up on the chart here. What ideas, what issues would you like to frame? What are some of them? Yes, Lisa?
Future success of Desert Rose.
Okay, let's talk about Desert Rose. What else? What other? Yes?
Community building.
Okay, Baha'i community building?
Within the faith, but I don't know if it's raising Baha'i.
Okay. Let's just talk about building community then. Okay.
Teaching efforts.
Teaching, okay. What else? Yes, Lee?
Improving the relationship between the local spiritual assembly and all of the believers in the community.
Okay, so LSA/community relations. Is that okay to say that?
Yeah, good enough.
Okay. What else?
Collaborating with community groups of like-minded people.
Okay, so like-minded community groups. Now, what we will do is use these to follow through, so your group will stay together. Once it forms around these, I will show you different techniques, and you can visit other groups, generally. But I want you to get the idea now. We frame the big picture. We're going to follow this through in each of your own groups. Okay? What else? Yes, Elizabeth.
Making individual initiative in the 5-year plan.
In the role of individual initiative? In 5 years?
Individuals.
Okay, you said making?
Yes, like individuals making initiative in the 5-year plan.
Okay. Okay.
Or taking individual initiative. Maybe that's it. Taking individual initiative. It's like ownership, okay? What am I going to do? Taking individual initiative in the 5-year plan.
Okay, I'll put taking right there. Taking individual initiative. How people can go about taking charge. Okay, so we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Any others people would like to address? You want to go with those? Okay, so let's just very simply set out and see what we've got. The person that offered the suggestion, if they could please space themselves around the room, and we've got 6, so we probably want 5 people per group. okay? And choose whichever group you'd like, but limited opportunities are available. Please do not sell spaces in groups. Okay, and let's just very simply say, Lisa, I know you were first, Desert Rose, Hill Building Community, and teaching up that side, and LSA, like-minded, and individual initiative on this side, okay? And just go to whatever group you'd like to go to. Your job now, what we're going to do is stay in these groups, but we're going to allow you to visit other groups. Okay? So you're confined to your group with visitation privileges, kind of like house arrest, maybe. We want you to develop a frame for your discussion in your groups. Now again, let me give you an example of that in some ways. A frame is the box. You know, let's just think outside the box. You know, we were just in Moab, and the T-shirt said, "Forget the box, just think outside." Yeah, because you just be outside doing stuff. Okay. I want you to really think, and let me offer one example. You know, just to kind of stimulate your thinking on framing. I was working with a state agency with about 80 people, and the director was very frustrated in the morale and the turnover within the agency, and he wanted to really start addressing the issues of concern to the employees in the agency. And so he asked me to come in, and he said, anything is possible. Just talk to them and see what we can do. So we worked together for 2 days, and we essentially reframed their understanding of what their job was, but one of the ideas when we went with a really big frame was to rewrite state law. Imagine state employees wanting to rewrite state law. Well, we built, and you'll see how we'll build up a really strong option there. We're going to build up a really strong possibility for doing that, essentially. And they went through and refined it as we went, and then they presented it to the director, and the director said, this is great, signed off on it. They introduced it at the state legislature, and it passed. So all those employees were so motivated because they got a chance to really do something. And as a result, not only were they motivated, but the morale and the turnover, really turned around within the department. But we didn't frame it in a way of, well, how can we address all the problems you guys face? If we would address morale, it would be, okay, let's have a casual Friday, and we can bring our dog on Tuesday, that type of thing. But if you really reframe it in a really big picture, like I said, you end up rewriting state law. You end up doing something big. Now, again, I'd like you to allow for the opportunity of something big. You don't have to go there if you don't want to. But until you kind of frame it in that broader way, you won't see the opportunities that might be available. So in each of the areas, I want you to, first of all, work on a frame. So a frame for Desert Rose, and I give in your handout how to begin the frame. Here are some examples, just very simply, with a barking dog. The initial frames might be your dog has to go, my dog has to stay. The better frame is how can we work together to help your dog? Okay? Rent payment might say they need to be evicted or this apartment needs to be repaired. The better frame says how can this apartment meet everyone's needs? I mean, it's open, it's positive, it's neutral, it's balanced. The product purchase says I will sue them to get my money, or they agree to buy the product. But the better frame is how can we address the needs of both the business and consumer? And the frame that everyone's in, is probably recognized as we talk about teaching children's classes, and this I think is in book 3. The initial frame says teaching children is very important, but it seems an impossible task. Today's children behave poorly, and nobody can stand to be around them. This is right out of Ruhi. You recognize this, I hope. The better frame says teaching children is important. It's something I like to do. The children in the village are very special. I consider them my friends. Now, Cindy and I were teaching in India about 7 years ago. And it was so funny because you really see the guidance that we're given when you work in villages around the world. Because we walk into a village and we say, children's class in India, we got 30 kids in 5 minutes, right? Just out of nowhere. There's not the distractions in society there. Here, I'm busy playing my video game, I've got homework, I've got to go to soccer practice, then I have to go to chess club. Everyone has so much to do. But there, they're all free and they're all interested. So it's a very different series of possibilities, but you really see the guidance for the whole world rather than thinking of it in terms of just guidance for America or Canada. So, I tell folks, and forget up here, I do say children's classes, but no, cross that out because you're working in your particular area. How can we work together to fill in the blank? What is this? How can we work together to create an international institution recognized for virtues-based training that will be, adopted by people around the world? I mean, Desert Rose. I'm not saying you want to do that, but that's an example of raising the level up. You talk about building community. How can we create a sustainable, happy community? Maybe. I mean, it depends what you can focus on, whatever you want to focus on, but leave it in that bigger picture sense. How can we work together to create an environment where individuals feel free to express themselves through their own initiative? Okay? These are not the answers for you. These are examples of what you might discuss in your frame. The frame, the thing about this is the big question, and I want you to keep in mind the frame establishes the boundary, or the question establishes the boundary for the answer. The question defines the boundaries. So if it's a narrow question, do you plan on a small field? If it's a bigger question, you go to a bigger field. If it's too big, it becomes unmanageable. If your frame says, how can we work together to create, the most great peace? Well, okay, maybe too big. But almost thinking about what are the incremental steps. Okay? So talk about it in your group, and then we'll hear what your frames look like. And I'll be around to answer questions. This is the most difficult thing to do right now. Because you have to kind of decide the size of this box you're creating. It's easy to start small and focus on, we could hire a different teacher. Let's try moving down the street. You can change the time to 10:30 a.m. Right? If we talk about children's classes, for example. But the bigger frame, what is the vital quality of educating the future of our community? What do we really need to accomplish with nurturing young lives? Just as an example, I'm thinking about creating those higher levels of frames. So, frame in many ways looks at the 4 questions we talked about earlier. In many ways, why, what, how, and what if. It allows for answers coming from those different perspectives, at least. So let's go around. Now, this is going to be a 2-part exercise. This is part 1 tonight, and I want to hear where you're at on your frames. Part 2 of the frames is going to be tomorrow morning. And tomorrow morning, having slept on it overnight, miraculously your frames will improve. Okay? Because you'll be talking to your spirit all night, and the spirit will say, what the heck was that frame thing? And you'll say, I don't know, I don't really understand it. Well, let me give you some new ideas. Okay? You will have different insights as you reflect on it. Again, the whole purpose in doing this is to provide more and better choices. You don't need to do this every time. I wouldn't stop the meeting and say, hey, wait a minute, what's the frame here? I would say that, though, if it's a complex or emotional issue, or a very difficult issue. It's one of those things where you could start down the path and not set any guidelines and don't really care about empathy and explore a little bit of the truth and maybe frame a little bit and come up with some choices, and then you get to the point where you're ready to evaluate, and all of a sudden you realize, oh my gosh, there's a whole lot more to this than we realized. So one of the reasons of thinking like this in place is addressing those cases where there's a lot more than what you think might be going on. And as Baha'i communities mature, they have to be used to handling issues with more complexity. You know, there'll be issues that are more difficult to discuss. And the other half of it is we should not be spending as much time as we do in consultation. Consultation, it'll go on forever, and we can make a much better decision in a much shorter period of time. So we're going to take a look at designing those types of things. But remember, today we talked about just very simply setting guidelines, the empathy we have in responding in a caring way, asking better questions, and this is how we frame the issue. Let's go around and listen to the frames. I may make some comments as we do that. I want you to think about this overnight, and tomorrow morning revisit your frames and see where you're at. So let's begin with framing over here. So your issue is what? Oh no, it's LSA community relations, right?
Right.
Yes. Okay, so let's hear your thinking on it. Who would like to share?
We were talking about our seniors communities
Okay.
and how we can get them more active, and we decided that home visits would be the first one.
Back up. We're not solving the problem at all.
Oh, we can.
No. Don't think in terms of, it's like we were talking over here with this group. Don't reverse engineer the frame. Don't design the solution and go back and say, well, that's the frame that will fit. Okay? This is the part where you have a desert in front of you. And you're looking for the oasis. But unless you make a big enough desert, you may not find that oasis out there. Okay?
We don't have an oasis yet.
We don't have an oasis yet? Okay.
It was suggested that the issue of practicality
Okay.
in the relationship,
Okay.
that the defining of the true nature of a Baha'i community in the first place as a unique community should be established first. And the use of the feast and all of the different functions of the administrative order and using them in a practical way, defined by the result of the consultation to find out which individual Baha'i has this particular mission, so that the community allows itself to define itself. And then so therefore fulfilling these collective personal missions might be the key of assembly individual believer relationships.
Okay. Well, think about the fact that, it's okay to give it a vehicle. So if you're talking about LSA community relations, talk about how can our feast promote the highest and best relationships between the LSA and the community. That's fine as a frame. Okay. You don't have to go beyond that. You're deliberately saying, well, we want to restructure the feast, and the intent is to promote the strongest relationships in whatever way. How can we make our feast the most vibrant feast, the most attractive feast? How can we, it doesn't have to be the biggest issue in the world, but it should be the best aspiration that you have. Okay? Now, I want you to keep in mind, too, when they teach this concept, it's usually a 3-day class, and we're only spending about an hour on it here. Okay? But I just want to get you thinking about how you state the problem. Quite often, we don't even state the problem, and everybody heads off solving it. We don't know what it is we're solving. Just have to think about it. So the importance here is, this is one of the first points of unity, is agreeing on what it is we're trying to work together on. So, what do we know?
Well, if we can do one that is a little more focused and one that's more global.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, we had a big struggle with this because we keep getting pulled down into specifics, and it was hard for us to stay at a higher level and deal with, or think above it and try to get to a bigger, think bigger, right? So the one I came up with is, how can we work together to garner community support for creating a child development-centered community, where the community focuses on what the community will be like for our grandkids.
Okay, but now, keep in mind, you can make it much less orderly and just say, how can we work together to create a child-centered community? That's fine. That's fine.
Okay, well, this is another perspective. How can we work together to garner support from the greater community to plan and execute an activity of common interest?
One activity or activities of common?
And, well, either way.
Okay, no, keep in mind. So, you should be thinking about this because this is how you're stating the issue to solve. Now, it's easy in the material world to solve problems like building this structure. How can we build a structure that will house, 30 people for a conference center? Well, it should be 100 feet by, 50 feet. It should have ceilings that are 12 feet high. I mean, those are all material questions we can ask. We're talking now about social questions. They're much more challenging in that. Okay, what do we have? Okay, and what's your issue? What do you?
Community.
Community building? Okay.
And we had problems.
Okay.
We
You have possibilities. You don't have problems.
Yeah, we didn't know what a community was. I think that it was that a perception of Baha'is being an exclusive club.
Okay.
And in our communication, I was about ready to say, that's okay with me. But Andrea said that the Universal House of Justice said we couldn't have that. So
that's the issue.
That's the issue. So how can, we started out with how can all people work together to create a sense of belonging? And then things happened and we had a Mars and Venus kind of thing here going. And how do we address the spiritual needs of all people living in our neighborhood so that all have a sense of belonging? It kind of went there. And then there was a lot of other individual things that Leo's going to talk about.
Sure, my fault. I'm just making a list of all the stuff that I would ask in that frame. When you're bringing a community together, you got to find out what the needs of the community are.
And that's what we did in step 4 when we talk about exploring the truth. But okay, no, please continue.
I just got a bunch of things like
Sure.
how to create a feeling of belonging in the community, how to break down the walls of differences between people, look at the similarities, be all-inclusive, how big is the community, how diverse is the community, what are their spiritual needs, what makes you feel safe in the community, etc.
Sure, okay. But now, again, we're talking about taking those small circles of questions and bringing them together into the bigger circle. So what's the big circle that contains all of those smaller questions? Okay, that's the challenge. Because when you get to the bigger circle, then we're going to work our way down. Think of we're kind of at the widest point in the river now, going along, and we've developed these questions and we've widened it out, but we want to still keep it manageable. And so now we're going to start narrowing it after we do this. Okay, we're going to get much more specific in the stages from now on. But we want to give ourselves the best shot at being able to come up with a meaningful...
That's where the confusion was. Were you wanting a list like this?
No, we want to frame it.
That's what I'm saying. Did you want to frame like this? Like that?
Oh, a frame with a list of questions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, because... No, I want to frame with one question.
So is the frame...
A frame is one question.
How do we address the spiritual needs of all the members living in our neighborhood?
Okay.
All the people living in our
Go ahead.
neighborhood. Well, that was what she said. How do we address the spiritual needs of all the members, of all the people living in our community?
Okay. There was a little bit more to that here. Or was that the same thing?
There was a little bit different.
Right. Okay. How can we work together to address the spiritual needs of those in our community? So that allows for many different things. Now, if you said, how can we work together to address the spiritual needs of the children? How can we work together to meet the devotional needs of the community? How can we work together to provide meaningful dialogue, public discourse? How can we work, in any of those individual areas too? Or how can we work together to fulfill the needs of the 5-year plan? You need to kind of set the box in some way. This is just your best guess at how big the box needs to be. It's always a guess. You never quite know. You want to leave open possibilities, but you don't want to make it overwhelming in size. Okay. What do we got?
how do we work together to teach seekers is to meet seekers' needs, to entertain seekers, to excite seekers, to uplift seekers, to make the faith irresistible to them, to convey how much we care about them and how much we care about the faith. If teaching is not an act of love, it is ineffective.
Okay, now everything except the last, if, that's fine. That's fine. You can say it at that. I mean, it becomes a little more cumbersome if you kind of go through a list, but that's fine. But how can we work together to fully engage the seekers in our cluster?
Right.
You know, that leaves it open in some ways too. But that gives the example of the types of things you're talking about. Okay? But this is just the question. That's all we want. So, over here, what was this individual, or what is this question? Individual?
Yes.
Individual initiative? Okay.
Okay, this is individual initiative. How can we work together to encourage and accelerate individual initiative to ensure the success of the 5-year plan?
Okay. In your cluster?
We were just talking about that.
Okay.
And we feel this would be a question for the two of us as individuals in the community,
Okay.
as consultation at a feast, as discussion at a cluster reflection meeting, in any and every aspect of Baha'i life. Even if I visited a different community and I was there for 2 days, a weekend, a week, how can I work with you too?
Oh, so this is your own personal
This is
friend. Okay.
This is every individual's responsibility in the Baha'i community.
Okay.
You've got to each take initiative to make it happen.
Okay. Well, you know, it's interesting.
Copies of that, let you know.
I mean, so what role are we individually responsible for fulfilling the 5-year plan? I mean, you know, we're told that we can't do everything, but to me that means you have to do something.
Yeah.
Related to, okay. Desert Rose. Here we go.
How can Desert Rose become a sustainable community that fosters the growth of visitors and residents?
Okay, so how can Desert Rose become a sustainable community that fosters the
Growth,
growth of
visitors and residents.
visitors and residents? Okay, so it's interesting. So that's framed. That doesn't mention programming. That doesn't talk about community relations. That doesn't talk, except in the context of sustainability. How can Desert Rose become sustainable? Okay, so the answer, keep in mind, like I said, the question determines the box for the answers. The answers here are all going to be around sustainability in some way. So it's hard. I mean, to me, asking the right question is a very difficult skill. It's very difficult. And I can't always plan how to do it, when to do it. Sometimes the opportunity to do it rises. I'm able to do it. Other times it doesn't. Okay, but it really is a vital thing to do. The skill of framing is really difficult. Most times when I teach this, folks just can't get their arms around it until the following morning. That's why I like to teach it at the end of the day, because you'll think about it and say, okay, I think I get it now. Okay, I think I get it. But just think of it. This is the big question that gives you more choices. I think it is essential, but it's not always complete. I'm not sure how to say that. It's sometimes essential questions may be focused more specifically, but a frame is always broadly focused. Okay, if that might make sense. Think of a frame as just the big picture. You want a big enough area so you can come up with a meaningful answer. Your frame is expressed in. So what Paul Lample said is it's not about homes or Baha'i centers. It's about the spiritual nature of the community. Now you only need to raise the frame when you're stuck in trying to come up with a good answer. But you'll always get a better answer when you do frame, I feel. Okay? Yeah, you'll always end up in a better place. Yes.
This may not be entirely on the topic, but I often find myself in situations where I ask a question and I don't get the answer, and I want to ask another question. And I can sense the frustration at that point, and so then I don't ask any more questions. So it sounds like this could fit in there if I figure out how to frame the questions so that I understand what I'm asking, what I really want to get at. Does this fit in those smaller situations like that?
I would say sometimes they may not have an answer for the question that you're asking. So stepping back from that and giving them a little bit bigger territory to respond to may allow them, But then again, I think for some people, bigger questions are intimidating too. So it's a challenge in figuring out where that fits together. But if they're not able to answer in the way you define the box, you need to make a bigger box for them to answer it. Is that? Yeah. That's really what it's all about. It's making a, and part of it is maybe you're doing some of this now and it's working a little bit, it's okay, and we're doing a little bit of community building, we're doing a little bit of relationship building, or we're doing some teaching, but you want to think bigger. You want different answers than what you had in the past. Okay, old Einstein said you're never going to solve today's problems with yesterday's solutions, or however you worded that. Okay, we need a new set of solutions. And a frame heads in that direction. Now, a frame, again, is just positive, it's future focused, it's your intent, it's kind of a way of stating the issue that makes it solvable. Okay? That everybody agrees on. A frame, like I said, raises the issue to the level of unity. A frame should be something everybody in the group agrees with. Yes, that's what we need to work on. That will help us in some way address what we feel are the concerns around this area. Okay? So you've explored the truth. Now, in this class, we explored the truth by thinking about asking better questions. Your frame for this class right now is, and this class is somewhat make-believe, right? At each point, you have to pretend around a situation, or maybe even bring in a situation from the outside, but it's still somewhat artificial. But the point of this is to kind of go through this process, and then we'll check it out toward the end as we start to work more specifically on real-world issues. Okay? But for now, go through with your frame. Your frame should be real. It should feel real. But it's still, this is not a real community. You're not actually addressing, the real issue in quite that way. Work on your frame. I'll come around and talk to you about that. And then we'll go forward with the frames as the starting points. Okay? Now, do you need to always create a frame? No, you don't. Do you need to always, worry about empathy? If everybody is happy and in agreement? Not really. I mean, you don't have to do any or all of these steps. But these are the areas that I feel are the key areas to developing unity in action. That's really what we're talking about. Okay? So, talk about your frames, and I'll come around and talk to you in groups. A well-crafted frame is, you're halfway there. Understand that a well-defined issue is a great deal toward coming up with the best resolution for that issue. That if you don't do it at this point, we all go on and we figure, let's figure out what we're doing about this. And everyone goes a little different direction, and everyone's a champion of a little different cause. But when we define it well, we're all agreeing on it. This is a discussion. What I tell folks, you can discuss the frame for 15 minutes and then greatly compress your resolution time, or you cannot discuss it and spend hours consulting back and forth about what it is. Now, framing is very difficult, and it's a hard concept until you start to think about it. A frame needs to be locked around a time. It has to have boundaries of time. It has to have boundaries of place, boundaries of people, and kind of boundaries of the issue we're addressing. Okay? So, I mean, if we look at Desert Rose has boundaries around it, literally. I mean, the Institute does. The people that are here, the intent of this place, the ways in which it can grow. But frame, I love the quote that says, and it's a perfect quote up here on the walls up here, a frame is what separates the art from the rest of the world. Okay? It's a boundary. It's a boundary we have. And we're defining the boundary. And just as we said before, the question determines the boundaries for the answer. The frame determines the boundaries for the possibilities you're about to consider. So a frame should both expand your vision into something more than it is now, but it should also limit your vision into something that is manageable. So you're kind of playing with that area. A frame can always be edited, changed in any way you'd like. If you get halfway through and say, well, let's go back and look at our frame. Think of the frame as almost the guideline for the issue. This is the guideline we're using for the discussion we're having around this issue. And if folks say, well, I think we ought to do da-da-da-da-da, I say, well, yeah, that's great, but that's a little outside of the frame that we defined. So a frame, in many ways, is a form of a guideline. Okay? Now, there is no perfect frame. The frame I mentioned earlier when I said, how can we... I like frames that begin with, how can we work together, because it implies service and unity. We and working together. So you have the, how can we work together to, and the, fill in the blank. Earlier when I said, how can we work together to help a dog live according to what this community feels is acceptable? It's bounded. It's bounded by the community. Okay? It's bounded by the people that are present. It's bounded by talking just about dogs in that case. You know, we can't say, how can we work together to create anything we want? It's almost like in Paul Lambert's tape. Remember, he said, well, we can't do everything. Right? He said we can't go on and just everybody do everything. But we don't want to just do one thing. And that was really a good... So a frame is just a feeling you have about having a big enough area to work within to find the solutions that the community might be interested in pursuing. Okay? It's designed to open up possibilities. Some people love framing. Some people feel very challenged by framing. And understand that. Understand that. And some people might want to go, some people might want to go both ways. Okay? But you know, a frame for people is, oh, that's just too big, man, that's just too... And we're going to take a look at different styles of negotiation to give you an idea of people's comfort levels around how we resolve issues. But let's go around and hear what you have for frames. Now, there's no perfect frame. Frame is just a starting point. Don't worry if it needs to be bigger, smaller, or different. That's fine. But we're going to use this as a starting point. So let's go around and hear some of the different frames that we have. So, are you ready? Okay. Who would like to volunteer? Just, okay. Really today? Please, and yeah, you don't have to sing the secrets. Okay. Let's listen. Let's listen, please.
We are a remedial frame making.
Remedial frame making. Okay. Very humble.
Yes. And it is, the one that we came up with is how can we work together to create a seamless community?
Okay. Thank you. So seamless means...
Do you want to state the issue?
Oh, yeah, we don't know what you're...
The issue was the Baha'i community is perceived as being an exclusive club.
Okay. And so you want to reverse that by saying, how can we be open to all? Okay.
shoes teaching, how can we work together to best meet the needs of our friends when teaching the faith?
Okay. So again, think of the boundaries that we have here. Here we're talking about friends. We're talking about people that we know. Here we're talking about the greater community, creating a seamless nature there. Both of them are fine. They're just different perspectives of looking at that. Let's go over here and hear what we have. Greg, what do you... You seem to be up this time.
Okay. We were hoping to get involved with other religious communities and other communities of interest in the greater metro area. So we came up with, how do we work together to create to ensure the spiritual vibrancy of the youth in our community?
Okay, so focusing on youth, okay, and spiritual vibrancy as the goal. Now, a frame can also reflect a goal to a certain extent. Okay, spiritual vibrancy is the goal. Okay, seamless community is the goal. Working with our friends is the goal in that way too. Okay, let's continue around over here. What do we have? Oh, she's gonna.
We've tossed a couple times.
Bonnie?
So the last one that came down was how can the assembly and believers work together to manifest a radiant Baha'i community? And that grew out of how can we work together in a new Baha'i youth to build a relationship within the Baha'i community? We're
evolving.
Okay, no. But understand the population of people that they're defining there is how can the LSA and the community work together to create a radiant. Okay. Radiant, but the population in that group is defined. I mean, so any options we create should involve those populations of people. Should involve the concepts within the frame. If you think of it in this way, a frame is kind of the first step in starting to align our thinking. Remember, we talked about where opinions coincide. It's everyone working on the same issue. In 6 Thinking Hats, they talk about having aligned thinking, kind of using the same parts of your brain at the same time. And we're going to do more of that as we go. But yes?
Could parameters be used would parameters be similar to framing?
Parameters, yeah, well, a frame is a parameter. I mean, I think of a frame as a paradigm in some ways. A paradigm is just a boundary with rules, okay? And that's kind of what a frame is, too. It certainly is a boundary, and maybe you're going to be writing the rules to that, what takes place within that boundary, within that. Okay.
How can those who care about Desert Rose Baha'i Institute work together to realize the potential of Desert Rose Baha'i Institute as a successful Baha'i-inspired SED?
Okay. Now, very interesting. Now, you began with how can those of us who care about Desert Rose?
Yes.
Okay. What about folks in the future that you might want to care more about it? How do they come into it then? So how can like-minded individuals work together to create a more vibrant Desert Rose?
We aren't like-minded.
Okay. So
Unity and diversity.
No.
Yeah.
So who is that community that you described then at the beginning? How can...
Those who care about Desert Rose.
Okay, who is that community?
Anybody
Whoever wants to be.
join.
Okay, but who? What I'm saying is it people that have come here, people that know about it? Is it donors? Is it all those folks?
Any of the above by choice.
And anyone else. It
Do you
can
want
be.
to increase the size of that community?
Well, if somebody from far away is an advocate and wants to participate, they would become part of the we.
Okay, so by focusing on the we, you'll create an attraction that will bring in a bigger we.
Part of our founders was from
Using the French
Alaska.
one. Yes,
Okay. So stay with that. Now, at every point, we will test it out. Okay, we'll go through it. And when I say testing, people, you need to separate how can I say this? Do you remember at the beginning when I said the answer is not the goal is consultation? Okay. one of the real, well, what research has really shown in mediation is you need to separate options from solutions. Okay, so I'm going to caution you at every point. Don't get to the point where, I've got the perfect solution. That's great, but that's still an option because it may get better and better.
Well, we slept on what we had yesterday, and we consulted today, brought up new ideas, and decided to stick with what we had yesterday. So here's our new thought. How can we work together to encourage and accelerate individual initiative to ensure the success of the 5-year plan?
Okay. So think of that. Think of, when you think of the frame, think of the boundaries of the frame. Okay, one of the boundaries is the 5-year plan, being success, and how can we work together. And the we in that is who's the population?
The population is the Baha'i community, and we are
okay.
Whoever is dealing with it at the time.
Okay, the cluster, the
individual, the community, the cluster, the national, the regional, the national, the worldwide Baha'i community.
Okay.
So right now it's me and you.
No, but worldwide is too big. Me and you is too small.
You think so?
Yeah. I know so.
Individual initiative.
No. Individuals still take initiative, but we want to have a bigger box to play in.
Okay.
But the world is too big a box.
Okay.
So what's your box? How big a box are you playing in?
So you're saying that
How big is your sandbox?
we should put in our statement, say, this at a cluster meeting?
Oh, yeah. You want to say either
Identify
this
a place
cluster,
for the people.
this community, this whatever, but just define it in some way.
So if we brought it up.
Define, in all of yours, define the population that you're working with. Whether it's friends of Desert Rose or the people in the cluster or the friends that we have, or think of the cluster as kind of defining the population, defining the geography of it, defining in many ways almost when clusters were first defined. They were talked about as kind of communities that had a commonality, whether it was an ethnic, commonality or a geographic. It was defined. Clusters were defined as more naturally occurring boundaries, right? Remember when we first talked about those. So think of that. But think about, because for purposes of this activity, I want you to kind of have a specific place in mind. And if you're doing it, have a more specific place in mind too. If you're working at the World Center, maybe you say, how can we engage the entire Baha'i world? But if you're working in a more local level, make it into something, because that's something much more manageable, much more specific, and you'll have better results. And again, the point in the frame is a well-done, agreed-upon frame will lead you into more and better choices. And it's a discussion you can either have now as a frame or later when you're trying to struggle through and figure out which of these choices we want to take. So the time you invest in a frame will shorten the decision-making time in your consultation, if you want to do it. You don't always have to do it. I would suggest doing it for the big questions, not for the little ones. Okay, you don't need to frame for the time we're going to hold the next feast. The frame is too big a tool for that small of a decision. But if it's over the teaching plan you're going to have for the next 5 years, I think a frame is perfectly appropriate. In many ways, the 5-year plan is the frame that we're given. And how can we transfer that frame into something meaningful locally for us? Okay? How can we make that frame our own here?